This is Congress for the week of March 15th through 19th. This is Module 2. And again, I'm continuing our discussion of Davidson, Olezik, Lee, and Schickler, Chapter 5, which I began in the first module. And we'll finish in the third module, focusing on the issue of media, as in the latter part of Chapter 5 of Davidson, Olezik, DOLS, Chapter 5, and in Michael Robinson's fine piece on the three faces of congressional media. What I want to do right now in this module is lay out what I think Fenno has achieved in his study of congressional behavior in the district, home style, and which I've already suggested is at the core of the central part of Chapter 5, which is really a restatement of Fenno's framework. So let me first remind you, going back to last week, and when we first started opening up the discussion of what is representation and whether Congress is representative. Again, just to remind you, as I said and I repeated in the first module of this lecture, that there are four aspects or dimensions of representation that will guide our consideration of Congress's representative function and Congress's relative failure or success in embodying or performing that function. Representation is a set of physical structures that links the official to his or her constituency, and again, that's primarily discussion in Davidson, Olezik, and Schickler, Chapter 3, and primarily the definition of the district and the way the district operates, but also the party organizations and the different stages in the campaign, etc., in Chapter 4, etc. It is a set of procedures that transforms the candidate into something more than a private citizen, possessing something like representative consciousness. Primarily the process of election by seeking office by approaching party leaders or being approached by them, recruitment, and the actual campaign, which then, in running for office, transforms the nature, the consciousness, and awareness of the candidate. So a set of physical structures, a set of procedures that transforms the candidate by undergoing the campaign, etc. Third, a relationship between the representative's constituency, which again is implicit in what Madison's definition of representation is, and as you'll see, this and the last dimension of representation is what Fenno, I think, discovers, if that's the right word, in his participant, observer, empirical observation of members of Congress in their districts as they formulate a home style. And last, the fourth thing, and this is, as you'll see, what Fenno particularly does concentrate on, it's a state of mind, a subjective perception or orientation that exists in the mind of representatives, but which actually determines their behavior. Now that last one, again, I'm going to elaborate this a little bit when we come to the what Fenno claims to know in that's going on inside of the head of a representative. Now, you as a skeptical student and as a skeptical observer of human observation and the observation of human beings might say, how the hell does Fenno know what's going on in the head of a representative? After all, he's not clairvoyant, and he doesn't claim clairvoyance, which is why you have to read his appendix to Home Style, which I sent out to you, because he's going to argue that he discovered these elements of representative consciousness by watching the different behavior that they summoned in different circumstances, and that what he actually did was observe their behavior and then learned how to conceptualize it, classify it, and then establish its reality, which as we'll see, implies a kind of a correspondence between both external structures and perceptions, which manifest themselves in the behavior of representatives. So, again, to link this to our discussion in the first module, the whole study of home style and what the concept of home style is Fenno's attempt to describe, which is embraced by Davidson and Olezik, etc., to explain how the representative link exists in a world where the experience of representation is now ceased to be the amateur living half the year as a legislator in Washington and then living half the year as a citizen back in your district. And by the way, when we talk about turnover and incumbency, I think I neglected to mention this. The House really did embody this expectation of being amateur and part-time. Up until about the turn of the century, Congress only met about 4 to 5, 6 months at the most, depending. I mean, during the Civil War and other times of crisis, the Congress's session extended. But with the 20th century, it really did, as we already saw, got transformed into a career because it became full-time. Primarily, by the way, some historians and observers who somewhat whimsically quip that Congress became a full-time job when, in the late 20s, 29, I think, air conditioning was installed in Congress. And that's when Congress actually became full-time, because Washington is an armpit of a swamp, just like Columbia, South Carolina is, and is unbearable in the summer, actually a large portion of the summer. And there may be something to the notion that with the installation of air conditioning, that's when Congress really became full-time. But the really profound reasons were the expansion of the agenda of the federal government and therefore the workload of members of Congress, and hence the full-time job. But again, the question of home style is an attempt to describe how, in the absence of that original expectation of linkage, by virtue of actually living in your district under the laws that you craft as an amateur, is there still a representative link, and what does it look like, and how would you describe it, and how does it work? Fenno's book is an attempt to answer that question, and again, that's what Davidson, Olzik, and Schickler incorporate in the middle of this chapter. So, as you're going to see, God clearly knew that the world needed professors of political science. Because one thing that Fenno doesn't do particularly well is actually define what the concept of home style is, which is why God made me. Which is what, as you're going to see, I'm going to provide the definition that Fenno doesn't actually provide so much in either his book that we're going to discuss this week, but even in home style. So the answer, the question he's trying to, and I've already talked about his method, and you might, again, look at the appendix, why he chose these 18 different representatives, because he wanted to give he wanted to be able to make generalizations about the behavior and consciousness of members of Congress that were reliable across different members of Congress, all the way from like freshman members of Congress to veteran members, to those who lived close, to those who lived far away. And so he explains in the appendix why he chose. And then, of course, what he did was, again, he went and lived with them for a year. Now, I assumed he probably had to take a long shower after this study, but who knows. Anyway, so what's the heart of it? And the heart of it, I gave you the entirety of Chapter 1. And you'll see this is more or less what Davidson and Olzik incorporate in their chapter. What he discovered is that of the four is the discovery of the four constituencies. And by the way, he calls them, and I'm going to use the terms that he uses: geographic, re-election, primary, and personal. Whereas Davidson and Olzik use a different term. They call the geographic one the demographic one, as you'll see why. And the re-election, the supporters, for obvious reasons. The primary, the loyalist ones. And the personal. I prefer to keep his original terminology for this, because I think those terms are actually more useful for making the connection between external reality and internal consciousness that I think Fenno detects. What are these? And probably the best way to conceive of them is as of concentric circles. The geographic constituency is the district, and whose physical boundaries constitute the limits of the existence of this constituency. So the geographic constituency, or the demographic one, which is DOLS's term, is the entirety of the population that are contained within the district as the district's boundaries define it through drawing district lines, as we saw in Chapter 3, and the question of reapportionment and everything like that. And then the re-election one, which essentially means those people within the district who voted for the member of Congress in the last election. So by the way, these two, actually, as you're going to see, each of these four constituencies has a pretty defined external concrete existence. And again, as I said, you can conceive of them as concentric circles. The widest one is the geographic constituency. And then obviously, unless he got 100% of the votes, which nobody ever does, in his or her constituency, the next visible structure would be the totality of the people that have voted, and rather a plurality. And in a single member district, as we saw, that means literally you win the election, whoever has a plurality of the vote, even if it's not a majority of the vote. Now, of course, everybody wants to win a majority, and everybody wants to win by a landslide. And as I may have suggested, as Davidson, Olzik, or some of the other readings we suggested, how do political scientists define these things? Well, a landslide is defined by political scientists as an electoral margin that's more than 55%. So once a winner gets more than 55%, that's considered, again, a landslide. Beneath that, between 50 and 53% is called decisive. And then beneath that, of course, you're no longer dealing with a majority, you're dealing with a plurality, and a plurality simply means the most vote. But in a single-member district, where you can only have one winner of an election, then that can be a plurality, and the plurality can be pretty small, by the way. Now, most presidential pluralities in the nationwide vote hover between 40 and 50%. Most presidents in our history, for instance, have not been majority winners. Most members of Congress, depending on how many people are running and the election and the issues, probably are marginally majority. But again, as long as you get the most, if there are 15 candidates running for representative in your district, and you get 30% of the vote, you'll be the representative. So the re-election constituency, the supporters, are the ones who voted for the member for the representative. And then within that constituency, and this existed once primary elections became the means of nominating candidates, means, because don't forget, a primary election is an internal election within a party, unless you come from a state that has blanket primaries like California and partially Minnesota, where you can vote for people in different offices in different parties. But most primary states, first of all, about 9 states, remember, have caucuses, which are the most intense and closed form of party nomination. It's a popular form of nomination, but again, you might be aware of for those of you that pay attention to elections, the Iowa caucus, for instance, is probably the most famous one. And that's the most party-dominated one, because you actually have to go and argue with people and debate with candidates, and the supporters of different candidates within the caucus then try to garner support. And that's how the Iowa caucus works. You all meet in these big rooms, and then the supporters of different candidates, depending on the success of a candidate in attracting or persuading people to support him or her, move to that candidate. Most states have a primary form of nomination. And remember, primaries are called primaries because in the reform generated by the progressives at the turn of the century, they wanted to have a popular form of nominating rather than party organizations or bosses or machines, etc. And now the primary is the near universal plus the caucuses. And of course, within that universe of primaries, there are closed primaries, which the majority of primaries are closed primaries, where you have to declare your membership as a member of that party before you can vote in that primary. And you have to actually go to the polling place. And South Carolina is a relatively closed primary state, where you have to actually go to a polling place and at least have to request a ballot of that party. So you have to, in other words, have an identity of that party. Open primaries are where you can go in and request a ballot of either party, and a blanket primary. Relatively few states are that. So the primary constituency then, and this is why Davidson and Oleszek and Lee and Schickler in Chapter 5 call it the loyalist, is because those are the supporters within the party who then support the representative. And then that's clearly smaller than the re-election constituency that voted for the candidate. And then last, the smallest constituency is the personal constituency, the intimates and friends and family. And so Fenno's point is, this is his discovery. You say the main thing that he discovered in doing this study is that these four constituencies exist, not only as external structures, but as perceptions in the mind of the representative. And you could say, how does he know this? Because he actually saw their behavior changing as they adopted and responded to these various constituencies. So this isn't just a projection of his interpretation on their internal consciousness. He would claim that he discovered them because he saw members of Congress empirically reacting differently to these different constituencies. And so both of these are an external structure, but they're also a perception and therefore a state of consciousness. They correlate to an objective structure. And for those of you who are English majors and like literary criticism and have read T.S. Eliot, you know, the great poem of the wasteland, and so ends the world not with a bang but a whimper, the great American English poet. He was born in America, and then he went to that British country. He became a British citizen. But he was also famous for his theory of literary criticism, and in particular his theory of art, which is the idea of an objective correlative. That's T.S. Eliot's term. And by objective correlative, he meant that all great art has to connect with a subjective experience within the person observing the art, or else it doesn't affect you, and therefore it doesn't touch you. But it has to have an objective correlative in the story or in the poem, an external thing to which you can attach your consciousness. And so, in a way, that does describe the term that Fenno claims to have found here. These constituencies are the objective correlative of states of consciousness within the representative. And why? Because perception determines and affects behavior. Why is this important? Again, because as you're going to see, what Fenno discovered was not just that members of Congress perceive these constituencies and straights, but that in perceiving and reacting to them and trying to relate to these different constituencies, members of Congress try to construct a representative relationship, and that relationship is what he calls home style. So you could say, putting it all together, because we're going to see what the definition of this concept of home style is, the Pulvordian definition, and the elements, the parts of this thing called home style, this constructed representative relationship, the stages, and Davidson and Oleszek have a pretty full discussion of this, and I only gave you parts of the chapters where he introduces this, that home style is essentially, you're going to see, a form of career identity and career behavior. And that it goes through stages. It not only has elements like the Freudian concept of human personality has elements like id, ego, and superego, or like in Dr. Dunn, the superego, the even more superego, and the superest ego. Just kidding. I love that man. Well, I have profound affection for him. Anyway, but that it goes through stages. Like you could say a marriage goes through stages. Some marriages go through lots of stages. But, you could say when you're married, you go through a stage of kind of acquaintance, and then you realize that the person you married is not the person you fell in love with, and that they never pick up their socks or do the dishes or take out the garbage, and they never listen to what you say. Well, that's an adjustment. And then we'll see. The book ends with some sober, but as you're going to see, I think, optimistic or positive reflections. That is to say, I'm going to suggest that Fenno comes to the conclusion that Congress and members of Congress really are representative of the American people. Why? Because they try to be. We'll explore this more. And that members of Congress, because of the impetus of re-election, go through this process of trying to form a link with their constituencies, which actually affects their behavior. And so let's see how he does this. Now, by the way, just a note, I decided not to use this article just to cut down on readings, but Fenno had a follow-up study to Homestyle, which it essentially completely concentrates on members of the House, as does his book that we're going to discuss this week, The Challenges of Congressional Representation, which essentially are studies of members of the House. But he did a further study with respect to the Senate. And what Fenno discovered is again, with direct election of the senators, now senators kind of have to relate as representatives to their states now. But that it goes through definite stages because senators have a 6-year term. And let me just briefly summarize that. Whereas I've already said in the last module that members of Congress are running all the time for the House, are running all the time. And that's, in some ways, our electoral reformers force them to be constant campaigners, also legislators. Whereas the 6-year term of the Senate allows senators to go through a cycle of in the first 2 years of their 6th term, they concentrate primarily on legislative and governing. In the second year, they kind of start paying attention to campaigning, and in the last 2 years, they become like members of the House in a constant campaign. But senators can go through this kind of different attention to, they are freer to pay attention to governing because of the length of the term, which is, of course, what Madison and Hamilton anticipated in their discussion of these institutions, if you remember. But then the other thing that Fenno discovered was that there's a 5th constituency for senators, the national constituency, which also confirms, if you remember, the expectation that members of the Senate would have a more national outlook on things, and that this 5th constituency tends to be an issue constituency. Like, for instance, Kristen Gillibrand during the Me Too movement kind of became she's a senator from New York, and interested and very involved in the Andrew Cuomo sexual harassment issue. But also Chuck Schumer, who's the majority leader of the Senate now, and that this national constituency tends to be an issue-dominated one, and that members of the Senate often become associated as national spokesmen for a certain issue, whether it's climate change or again, the Me Too movement or something like that, or the minimum wage, like Bernie Sanders. With that in mind, let's actually then examine this concept. So I've already told you what his discovery is, these 4 constituencies. And now here's the definition of homestyle. What is the concept of homestyle as he develops it here? And how does that form the basis of this representational link that he's looking for? It's the professional personal persona. Lots of P's in that sentence, just like Polvorty. It's the professional political persona of a member of Congress that evolves over time and links a member of Congress with his or her constituents. Now, I purposely and deliberately chose each of those P words. The word persona actually kind of comes out of Jungian psychology. And actually derives from the Greek word persona, actually means a mask, and refers to the dramatic masks that Greek actors would wear because they would perform their plays in the amphitheater and in the assembly, which held 25,000 people. It would be like going to Death Valley in Clemson and performing a play. And actually, I did go to see Elton John and Billy Joel in concert in 1996. Where there were 100,000 people there, and you saw these little blips down there, and you had to see them on television screens. And I didn't have a lighter, but I have to say it was fascinating to see these great concerts. And I'm not really a rock person or whatever you call the music after Petula Clark in 1965. Billy Joel did sing Your Song, and Elton John did sing Piano Man, and that just turned our world upside down. All right, anyway, so a persona. In Greek drama, the persona was the mask that the actor put on, which had two functions. It actually was a megaphone that amplified his or her voice. It was his voice, actually. They didn't have female actors back then. And yet it also it enabled the audience from a distance to identify the character because they were tiny blips. So in Jungian psychology, persona becomes a function of personality. It's the external mask of personality that you fashion over time and that you show to the world, and that filters your behavior and connection with the world around you. So it's both a mask, but again, it's also how the world relates to you and how you relate to the world. It's the political persona. So as you're going to see, Fenno argues that as members of Congress get used to being members of Congress, they evolve into their career, they develop this persona, this way of presenting themselves. And in fact, presentation of self is one of the elements that both Fenno and DOLS talk about in this. But it's a political persona. You could say that each of us adopts the social company in a certain way and projects our and we may be internally shy, but we have the external personality of a Dr. Dunn, who's actually a tender and reflective introvert. Anyway, the political persona means it also include a political identity, an ideological identity, and of course that's usually contained in the party identification, the party label that a member of Congress adopts. But it's professional, and you'll see all members of Congress do this, and so home style is a way of presenting yourself to the constituency so as to make them re-elect you. And again, this is part of the career consciousness that it derives over time. It evolves over time, and now again, the skeptic in you should say, well, this just means that they learn how to manipulate their image. What Fenno is claiming is this is not just like a fake covering that like when you pretend to like somebody in order to get something from them. Fenno argues that this persona, this way of being at home in your district, the home style that you evolve, first of all, he said you could actually see the components of it, and therefore what I'm identifying as the elements aren't just my projection onto them. You can really see that members of Congress really do embody these aspects, and that they go through these stages. He observed them in these 18 different members of Congress. So, and again, the point I'm making is that this isn't just a put-on face. It's a real presentation of yourself and the way that you want your constituents to see you, yes, so that you can relate to them and generate your own re-electability. What are the elements? And again, this is in Chapter 5 and in Fenno Chapters 3 and 4. But there's a good, again, I only give you a few excerpts, but enough to understand them. The three are, the three elements of home style aren't just the activities, although they are based in the activities that representatives pursue. It's presentation of self, and in turn, you can read the whole chapter if you want, in Fenno. What's in the presentation of self? A communication of qualifications for office, and an identification with the people in your district, especially the re-election constituency, and empathy. As Madison says, by the way, an immediate sympathy with the passions, opinions, and interests of your constituents. Your constituents have to feel that you understand them. And by the way, it's not just that you're communicating that you are trying to impress them with your ability to understand them and trying to make yourself into a re-electable commodity. You actually are trying to understand them. And that may or not be the same thing as agreeing with all their opinions, by the way. But as you're going to see, all members of Congress, he discovered in observing them, try to present themselves, and that contains these three elements: qualifications for office, identification with your constituents, and empathy for them. The second element, and this is the link, this is why Chapter 5 comes after Chapters 3 and 4, brilliant, and before Chapters 6 and 7 in the internal dynamics. Because since you are no longer living among your districts, you have to compensate for that loss of intimacy that you had because you lived there or grew up there and everything. That never leaves you to some degree. But since you become now a denizen of Washington in a full-time job, you are left with a problem of how to explain a part of your life that your constituents can't see and can't understand. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about Arnold's framework in the first module. And so explaining Washington activity, trying to convey a sense of why you vote the way you do or why you support the position, and why you are active and how you are active as a legislator, and why your legislative activity represents your link to constituents. So explaining, and then constituency service. And again, Davison and Olizik are good at describing this aspect, and so that's why I didn't require so much those components from Fenno's original book. That you are there to help your members, no matter what their party, no matter what their ideology, that you are there to help them with their constituency issues. So those are the three elements of home style. And then the stages. This is in Chapter 6 and Chapter 5. And so it turns out that members of Congress, especially when they are the incumbents over time, that it goes through two stages. And by the way, expansionist and protectionist. And expansionist essentially means trying to expand your re-election constituency, the margin of people who voted for you. And as you become a veteran and a lifelong servant, so your aim begins to protect and to hold on to that re-election constituency. Because, of course, of all the four constituencies, the re-election constituency is the one that's critical in terms of maintaining you in office. Although the primary constituency, the loyalists, you have to hold their loyalty within the party to get nominated. But there is a certain sense in which expanding and preserving the re-election constituency constitute the major phases, stages of this. So that's what home style is, and so what's the importance that Fenno derives from this, and why does he come away from his study finding a kind of, in other words, an answer to the question, is Congress representative of the American people? And are the members of Congress representative of their constituencies? He says, yes. Why? Because they strive to be, because that's how they get reelected. Now, that may not lead to a robust sense of identification with every political position or issue position in constituencies. And by the way, you'll see both in home style and in Fenno's book, Fenno doesn't think that simply reflecting the policy preferences of your constituents is the essence of the representative link, but rather this kind of fashioned persona is. And so as I bold on the top of the last page of the notes, Fenno's conclusion about the representative character of the institution, that all members of Congress, and here's the key, even the ones who have been there for many terms, the incumbents, feel unsafe. No matter what stage of their career they're in, the expansionist or protectionist, no matter how many times they've been there, all members of Congress run for re-election as if they have to. And of course, it helps to have a challenger and a feasible challenger. But his argument is this feeling, even in the safe districts, even if the re-election constituency was a landslide, nevertheless, members of Congress possess this a constant insecurity about being re-elected. And that's the internal disposition, in some ways, that Fenno claims to have discovered. Even the veterans, and that this encourages them to craft a home style that successfully connects them to their constituents, and that is, in fact, a real relationship of representation or representativeness, which is based on the internal perceptions of members of Congress. Now, we'll pursue this with his updated version of the book, where he takes this framework and applies it to the 5 members of Congress that he observes and then reflects on. But you'll see that even in that book, he sustains this kind of somber embrace of the notion that whatever else you want to say about members of Congress, they do strive to identify with their members, the constituents, represent them, and to stay in office by virtue of being seen and actually connecting with their constituents. That's home style. Now, whether or not that persuades you that members of Congress are genuinely representative of their districts, we're going to see that actually some of the dysfunctionalities that people perceive in Congress may actually be not because they're not representative of their districts, but perhaps one possibility is that they are, in fact, overly representative. That's an interesting puzzle that we'll see later on in the course.